Hi, this is Hiki with the Lost Samba podcast, the address of the best of the Brazilian music. In this podcast, we're going to talk about what gives a name to it, samba. No one really knows where samba comes from. Probably it's a mix of rhythms that come from different parts of Africa with enslaved people who arrived in Brazil. And this samba is the same as blues, reggae, salsa, cumbia. The influences are all the same. You can go to Portugal or to Spain. No one did the samba throughout its history. There may have been Arabic music at one point, but this has nothing to do with samba. Normally, we associate these rhythms with partying, with feeling good and stuff like that, which is true nowadays. The music that comes from Africa is very jolly, but it gives a kind of a distorted image of what that meant in the origins for those very, 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 very oppressed people. Brazil has a horrible past in relation to slavery. It was the biggest recipient in the world of enslaved people from Africa, more than the United States. And it was the last country to abolish slavery. Slaves who managed to work in the households, they were much better treated. But in general, the slaves who worked in the fields and who worked with cattle, they had like awful, 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 awful experiences. The life expectancy of a slave at work would be 5 years, and the idea was just once one died, you'd replace him with a new one. Now, one thing that's important to know and what makes it unique in Brazil, when the masters bought their slaves, they made a point in separating them from their families and from other people of their ethnicities. The reason for this is, I think, obvious. They didn't want people to be too close because that would help them revolt, or that would help them escape because they understood each other and they would protect each other. So in the farms, you had this huge number of people who didn't speak the same language, and the only thing they had in common was their situation, right, of being enslaved people. In this context, drumming, the drums and the rhythms became central to their social life. They'll meet each other, they'll talk to each other, relate to each other, and it was a kind of a religious thing. The guy would be playing a drum, people would sing, and they would dance to it. In some places, they would kind of get into trance where they would receive deities and everything. And this became widespread in the farms of Brazil. The Yoruba people, the people who come from Nigeria, they kind of became the dominant people. There were many, many, many ethnicities who came to Brazil. They were the main one. And they had a tradition where an elder would be like the big guy in these circles, right? And he would call in initiates or women who he fancied into the dance. And the way he called them in was by contacting his navel to the navel of the guest. The reason that they put navel to navel, there was this navel contact, is that they believed that the vital energy was concentrated there. So the vital energy of the senior participant would go to the more junior one, and he'd receive all the good vibes or the good spirits. In Brazil, navel is umbigo, so this until this day the dance of the umbigada. But in Yoruba, the navel is called Samba. So it's easy to figure out that there was a circle of people, a roda de Samba, of Samba. And when slavery was abolished, this was in the 1800s, many slaves, well, all of them became free. They went to the main cities and they continued with these rodas de samba or de samba. But the white people, who they hardly touched each other in their dances. It was like very formal, and you had to be invited, and it was like only for the elites. So these parties where people put their navel on another person's navel and dance together, they were considered too sensuous. The rodas de samba or the rodas de samba became prohibited, right? Because it attempted against the morality of the society, and it was done by black people who, in their view, were dangerous and uncivilized. If there was a roda de samba, the police would go there, or military, or the guys who worked for the big farmers to finish it. One of the places where these rodas were most popular is the region of the Recôncavo Baiano. That's the area around Salvador. And there was a huge migration. People who couldn't take it anymore. In Rio, it wasn't free from persecution, but it was more civilized and it was probably less violent. But the persecution continued. One thing that makes the Afro experience in Brazil unique is the quantity of uprisings that there were. Like the first uprising in the Americas came from slaves in Salvador, and they wanted to implant a Muslim state. They regarded that society as unfaithful, and they wanted to change it. Later on, and this is also unique, there was the experience of the quilombos, where slaves would escape their farms, which was very risky, obviously, and they'd make their own communities of people. And some are there until the current days near Rio, near São Paulo. But also there was like this aggregation of quilombos in the state of Alagoas, called the Quilombo dos Palmares, and that must have lasted at least 100 years. They had their king, and they resisted the Brazilian or Portuguese armies for all that time. Although people tried to hush it, the story spread, and stories, as with any story, when they spread, they exaggerate things, or they tell it in the wrong way. So it's not very well documented, but the legend was always present within the Brazilian Afro community. And this generated a lot of pride and a lot of strength and belief in their own people. Anyway, the reason for this podcast isn't to discuss history, it's to discuss music, and more specifically samba. Because Rio was the capital not only of Brazil but of the Portuguese Empire for such a long time, and especially at the time that we're speaking about, it is seen as the center of samba, which isn't very true, because samba comes from several origins, as we discussed in the beginning of the podcast. But to understand samba from Rio, you have to start with a central figure of that history called Tia Ciata. Tia Ciata comes from the same town as Caetano Veloso's family, Santo Amaro da Purificação in Bahia. Tia Ciata came from Santo Amaro when she was around 20 years old as a slave. It's a very musical town. The samba that comes from there is very African. And this is the origin of the samba that Tia Ciata took to Rio. Tia Ciata was initiated in Candomblé. She was more than initiated. She was a practitioner. She was what you'd call a mãe de santo, like a priestess. And for some reason, she was allowed to sell food in the streets for her owner, which was quite common. She'd sell it and the money would go to the owner. The food that she sold was from the Candomblé. They have holy foods there, which they offer to the deities. Her idea, which was very good, was to sell this to the general public. Now, this became a huge success, a must-go place. Everybody at lunchtime or when they were going home, they knew that there was a stand of Tia Ciata, and they'd go there and buy these delicious foods, and she became quite well known. Whoever has been to Brazil, mainly Rio and Salvador, but other states too, will know the figure of the Bahiana that sells food on the streets that are typical from Bahia. They dress in the same way that Tia Ciata would dress, which, by the way, isn't Tia Ciata's invention. This is what they would wear in the Candomblé ceremonies. Until this day, the people dress in the same way, selling the same food as Tia Ciata did more than 100 years ago. I'm not sure how, but this was common at the time. She managed to become a free Afro woman. She cut the ties with her owner, I'm not too sure how. And probably because of her power in the Candomblé, the power of her prayers or the magic that she did there, she managed to do something that was very, very, very rare at the time, which is to marry a successful Afro-Brazilian businessman. They joined forces, obviously, and they kind of grew a little empire out of that stand. So they managed to buy a house in an area, wasn't designated exactly for that, but that was where the freed slaves or the freed Afro people lived. Now, this is the same time that Brazil was receiving a lot of immigration from Europe, especially anarchists escaping the craziness in Europe. This was like pre-war times. It was complicated in terms of relationship with landowners and factory owners and workers. So a lot of people came from Spain, from Italy, lots of Jews, and they all concentrated in that same area. So this area became a area of like bohemian nightlife because of all this mixture. Now, the elite didn't like samba because they thought that the place of the black people was working for them as slaves. You could go to prison if you were caught doing, partying with samba, or you were mixed with candomblé, or you did capoeira. It was like borderline illegal. But what changed Tia Ciata's destiny in this scenario was that the president of Brazil, Wenceslau Braz, he got seriously sick. And no doctors could cure what he had. All right, so he tried all sorts of doctors. Nothing cured him. I think it was an injury in his foot or his knee, something like that. And someone had heard about Tia Ciata and called her in and she cured him. It was almost like a miracle. He couldn't believe it. So because of this, she gained a special status. So her house became like a mega cultural center, right? If Candomblé was in, and Samba and capoeira or anything to do with black culture was semi-legal, in her house anything went. And it became obviously the birthplace of Carioca Samba as we know it nowadays. Huge talents emerged from there. Donga, Senhor, João da Bahiana, and Pixinguinha, who was like a genius in the Brazilian sax. He became friends even with Louis Armstrong later. The song I'm going to play today is called João. João means, it's not a Portuguese word, it's a Yoruba word. Its title means to say recent initiate. So it's more or less about a party of a recent initiate, and it says how there'll be people who belong to this saint or to that saint. Every one in the Afro religion belongs to a saint, right? Anyone, even the people who don't believe in it, they actually belong to a saint. I belong to Oxóssi, the hunter. But there'll be Oxalá, that's the spiritual god, Ogum, that's the warrior. They're saints for everyone, for women also. There's a pretty saint. There's the queen of the ocean, Iemanjá. There's several. I won't give the entire list, but in the song they say, well, they're these women who belong to this and this and this saint, and they'll go to the house of the Preto Velho, which is the old black guy, which is another spiritual entity that's very common in Candomblé. So it's a music about Candomblé, and it's very catchy, and it was written by the genius of Pixinguinha. And it was sung by João da Bahiana, by Clementina de Jesus, who merits a podcast just for her. She was a housemaid who went to the Candomblé and was discovered by this music critic who made her big at a relatively late age. I think she was in her 50s and her 60s when she became famous, and she became like the voice of the Afro-Brazilian people at one time. Aqui có no terreiro pelo adié faz inveja essa gente que não tem mulher. Aqui có no terreiro pelo adié faz inveja essa gente que não tem mulher. No Jacutá do Preto Velho há uma festa de Jaú. No Jacutá do Preto Velho há uma festa de Jaú. Oi tem nega de Ogum, de Oxalá, de Iemanjá, Mucama de Oxóssi é caçador. Viva Oi tem nega de Ogum, de Oxalá, de Iemanjá, Mucama de Oxóssi é caçador. Viva Oxalá, de Iemanjá, Mucama de Oxóssi é caçador. Viva nanana. No terreiro de Preto Velho, iaia, vamos saravá. Quem é o pai? Xangô. as a quirk to this podcast, uh, I'll say that in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, when I was growing up in Rio, the presence of macumba, or of we would call it macumba in a very detrimental way, but of candomblé and banda and the Afro religions was much more pronounced in our day-to-day lives. So it would be common for you to be or going to work or going to school or going out to the supermarket, and you suddenly see in your corner a dead chicken with blood coming out of their neck, next to some candles and a bottle of cachaça next to it. Um, and this was very, very, very common, and people believed it. Even white people, they said that they didn't believe it, the same way that families said, no, we have nothing to do with black people, but they knew that they were. And there were many white people who went to the candomblé, who believed it, who asked for favors for the deities. And it was much more pronounced. It was part of the day-to-day life of people. Then gradually, in the 80s, 70s, the evangelicals came and said that this was something of the devil, that people shouldn't go, and that Christ would punish them, and they would go to hell if they went to Candomblé. And unfortunately, this tradition gradually became marginalized. In Rio, in El Salvador, it's still quite strong. Although there are these evangelical uh, people or churches that they have the same thing. It's a thing of the devil. No one should go, and it's evil, which is not true. Um, anyway, uh, also the biggest imprint, the Candomblé and the Tia Ciata and all this samba, apart from the samba that's like Rio's uh, um, homegrown music, known in the entire world, the origin of bossa nova, and there's no one in the world hasn't heard of samba and its presence in the Brazilian football, the way they play. Um, but the biggest, like, palpable legacy of these times, or of this religion, is the New Year in Rio. Like when I was young, right, a long time ago, but in the 60s and the 70s, on the New Year, you went to the beach. There were all these tents with candomblé full of um, uh, people, playing the drums at night. There were candles everywhere, and you'd have the Bahianas doing their moves, and it was like a proper uh, um, 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 macumba or candomblé encampment. They really took over the beaches, and this was all because of Iemanjá, that's the god of the oceans, and they'll take offerings for her. The belief was that if you take offerings and they went out in the ocean, it would be a good year. If not, if they came back, not so good. And this gradually, people said, that's interesting, I'm going to take a look. And more and more people started going, and gradually it became like the big thing in the Rio. So nowadays, if you go to Rio on the New Year, you'll see like millions, literally millions, 4 or 5 million people by the beach, everybody dressed in white. The presence of the candomblé is minimal. You see one or two people doing it, and it's a beautiful atmosphere. You won't have the drums, but you'll have the huge fireworks, and the magic is in a way still there, but much bigger. Or the candomblé presence is hidden there, but it's the origin of the great Carioca New Year celebrations. Okay, I hope you enjoyed this podcast, and I hope to see you again next week or in 2 weeks' time. Thank you very much. Beleza, aquele abraço.